So about a year ago, I was in a discussion with someone about yoga, and they told me that they believed that yoga is fundamentally patriarchal. Patriarchal meaning supporting a society which is predominantly controlled by men. This was a surprise to me, as I've been practicing and studying yoga for many years, and I'd never come across the idea that yoga was fundamentally patriarchal. I didn't think much more of it, but recently I heard this claim being made again, along with the view that one of the most famous authors in yoga, a man called Patanjali, was possibly a misogynist. And it appears that these ideas are beginning to take a foothold in Europe and North America. So I decided it would be a good idea to look at where these claims are coming from and to see whether they are justified or not. This idea seems to be coming from a misunderstanding of some verses in a 1,500-year-old Sanskrit text called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and especially one particular verse in that text. The verse in question is verse 22 in chapter 2, and it refers to something called Prakriti. So Prakriti is not an easy word to translate into English, but it's essentially one half of existence. It could be translated as manifest creation, or all phenomena, or the universe, or all physical and subtle matter and energy. It's fundamentally different from pure awareness, which is called Purusha. So Prakriti is that which is observed by the Purusha. It is the seen, with Purusha being the seer. Now verse 22 of chapter 2 is talking about the process of spiritual liberation, and is referring to a particular stage in that process. And the verse reads like this: even though it, perceivable existence, disappears for one whose purpose is accomplished, it does not disappear for others who hold it in common. The verse is basically saying that for the yogi who has completed their journey, Prakriti disappears, even though it's still seen by others who have not yet completed their journey of yoga. So people have tried to make sense of this verse in different ways. How could the perceived universe suddenly disappear for one who has completed their spiritual journey? I've heard various suggestions put forward on this. One is that maybe the yogi suddenly becomes blind, deaf and dumb. Of course, they'd also have to suddenly lose their sense of taste and smell. I've also heard it suggested that maybe the yogi suddenly dies, but remains conscious in a sort of eternal void where they can no longer perceive anything. The speculation over what this verse means has gone deeper than this. You see, Sanskrit is one of the languages where words are gendered, like Spanish and French. In Sanskrit, the word Prakriti is feminine, whilst the word Purusha is masculine. So some have even suggested that maybe Patanjali's goal was, through spiritual practice, to try to get rid of everything in existence that was feminine. Not just all women, but all of Mother Nature, all of the created universe. If this was his aim, driven by a deep-rooted hatred of the feminine and of women in general, then that would certainly make him a misogynist. So what are we to make of all this speculation and conjecture, and these strange ideas about people going blind and deaf, and about patriarchal society and misogyny? And how can we actually understand this verse in the Yoga Sutras? In fact, all of these ideas are fundamentally mistaken. Yogis do not suddenly become deaf, blind and dumb, and simultaneously lose their sense of smell and taste. We know that because hundreds of thousands of people practice yoga, and it does not happen to anyone. And they do not suddenly die and live in an eternal void forevermore. We don't have body bags at the back of meditation classes. It simply does not happen. The only way to really understand this verse is to actually do the yoga that Patanjali describes in the text, and to systematically go through the experiences that he describes that result from doing the practices. If we do this, then we can observe through our own direct experience how the practices lead progressively to different experiences, and then we can also see experientially what it is that Patanjali is describing in chapter 2, verse 22. We can know what he's referring to because it will be our lived reality. This is actually the only way that anything can be truly known in yoga. Anything else is simply speculation based on rationality, conjecture, and the imagination. It would be simply mind-based rather than arising from direct experience-based knowledge or true knowledge. In the text, Patanjali talks about how ignorance causes people to be completely identified with the things of the world, prakriti. The term he uses for this complete identification is samyoga, or complete joining. And when we practice yoga, we begin to be able to see this in action. We see directly how our perception of ourself, our purusha, is completely tied up with the objects of perception, with the mind and the body, with thoughts, emotions, memories, views, beliefs, opinions, and so on. The process of identification with the objects of perception even extends beyond the body and the mind to things like my house, my car, my children, my wife, my husband, my career, my nationality, and so on. And we can directly see how it is ignorance that causes this samyoga of the purusha and prakriti, this total identification of awareness with the objects of the mind and the senses. As well as describing this process that arises from ignorance, Patanjali also describes the process of entering samadhi through meditation. He describes the process by which the mind becomes calm and still through meditation, and talks about how the practitioner resides in their own nature when the mind is still. He also describes various kleshas, or obstacles, that exist in the mind, and he talks about how these kleshas can be seen and dissolved through the practice of meditation. He talks about how the state of vairagya arises in the mind, which is a state where the thirst that arises towards sense objects is completely mastered. He describes how absorption in samadhi results in knowledge of the higher self, or our true self, beyond the imaginations of the mind, resulting in pure bliss. Patanjali talks about the divine, the Ishvara, and about how its nature can be brought forth by the yogi through the recitation of the Omkara Nada, the primordial sound of Om. He describes how this perception of the divine leads to the disappearance of the obstacles to liberation. He describes how the mind becomes clear like a jewel, simply absorbing the hue of whatever it perceives, and how the mind becomes empty of its own form. He describes entering states of samadhi that are so deep that there are not even any subtle movements of thought. He describes coming to know the serenity and grace of the higher self, or our true nature, and coming to know the truth of the eternal, unchanging, natural order of all existence. And he says specifically that this knowledge does not arise from things heard, or from logical inference, or from informed conjecture. In other words, it is knowledge arising from the direct experience of the true nature of the self. And all of this is described in chapter 1, before we get to the verse in question about prakriti disappearing, which is in chapter 2. So if we practiced yoga, and go through the various experiences that Patanjali describes that I've just mentioned, how can we then understand verse 22 from chapter 2 coming from a place of direct experience? So what actually happens in this stage on the path is a merging of the subject and object, a merging of the seer and the seen. Rather than believing that we are somewhere in here, perceiving everything else that is out there, instead we come to see that everything is taking place within awareness, and that there is no separation between that awareness and the things within it. In fact, the things within awareness are no longer seen as separate things, but rather as one unchanging, unmoving vibration of energy. So Prakriti disappears for one who is awake, because there is no longer an other, no longer a sense of separation. At this stage in the process of spiritual awakening, the observer is the observed. Only the Purusha, the self, remains, and the yogi comes to know their true nature, their Swarupa. Everything is seen to be simply one thing, or Kaivalya in Sanskrit. The word Kaivalya comes from the word Kevala, meaning only one, or just one, or unity. Patanjali then goes on to discuss this state of unity, or Kaivalya, further, and he dedicates the last chapter of the text to it, which is a chapter known as the Kaivalya Pada. The last line of the text reads, "Thus, as a result of the qualities of nature becoming empty of any purpose, is born the state of unity, Kaivalya, in which one is established in one's own nature, Swarupa, or the power of consciousness, Chit Shakti." So that's from verse 34 in chapter 4. So the good news is that no one becomes blind, deaf and dumb because of the practice of yoga. No one dies and spends all of eternity in a void-like state of awareness, observing nothing. And the highest state of yoga is that of unity, or non-duality, which is also described in the Upanishads. What Patanjali is describing is no different from that of Advaita Vedanta, or the non-dual awareness of the state of liberation described in the Vedas. This understanding about what Patanjali was writing and these myths that are being spread about Patanjali in the West do serve as a reminder that we can only come to know yoga by practicing it. And the highest stages of yoga, such as those described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, can only be known through direct experience after many years or decades of dedicated practice.